They say silence is holy. But in Monza, there was a silence that screamed. A silence thick enough to hide betrayal, lust, and blood. Behind the convent walls, the prayers weren't for salvation, they were for survival. What I'm about to tell you is not pious. It's not pure. It's the secret the church wanted you to forget, because it exposes how holiness was weaponized, and how innocence was turned into currency. Picture this: Italy, 1575. A land suffocating under Spanish rule, where faith had become a mask for power. The Catholic Church was desperate to cleanse its image after the Protestant Reformation split Europe in two. And so it built its fortresses of virtue, monasteries, convents, holy walls that promised purity to the outside world. But inside, those same walls rotted. The convent of Santa Margherita in Monza stood like a stone confession no one dared to speak aloud. Within it lived a girl named Virginia de Leyva. A nobleman's daughter, imprisoned in holiness at just 13. She didn't choose God, she was sold to him. Her father, Count Martino, saw his daughter not as flesh and spirit but as a financial liability. In his world, daughters were expensive mistakes. Marry them off, lose your fortune. Send them to God, and your wealth stays untouched. So he locked her away, behind iron bars disguised as a crucifix. And from that day forward, the walls became her only witnesses. But here's what the church doesn't tell you: when you strip a human being of choice, devotion becomes rebellion. And in Virginia, something dangerous began to awaken. In her silence, she began to see through the theater of sanctity. Through the routines, the fasting, the hollow prayers that had nothing to do with divinity, and everything to do with control. The convent wasn't sacred ground. It was a laboratory of obedience. A place where noble daughters were broken down and rebuilt into compliant shadows, perfect symbols of piety for the world to see. And when a system depends on silence, the first person who speaks becomes its greatest threat. Because the moment Virginia whispered her first "no," the entire illusion began to crack. You've heard of sinners punished for desire. But what happens when the sinner is holy, and the holy is corrupt? That's the story of the Nun of Monza. And once you understand what she became, you'll start to see how every institution that preaches purity hides something far darker behind its walls. Every prison breeds a kind of madness. But the convent's madness was polite, wrapped in hymns and incense. It didn't scream. It whispered. And in those whispers, a young nun named Virginia began to dream of something she wasn't supposed to remember: freedom. Years passed. The child became a woman, yet she was still trapped in the body of a servant of God. She knelt until her knees bled, prayed until her mind fractured, and confessed sins she hadn't even committed, because that was what they trained her to do: submit, repent, obey. But even the most devout walls can't contain what is human. There was a man, Giovanni Paolo Osio. A nobleman from the nearby town of Monza. Handsome, reckless, and dangerous in the way only men who know they're untouchable can be. He came often to the convent on business, delivering messages, trading supplies, exchanging smiles too long to be innocent. At first, Virginia resisted. Every fiber of her conditioning screamed against the impulse. But desire doesn't ask for permission, it invades. It rewrites. And when the two finally met in secret, something ancient and unstoppable took root. They called it sin. But to Virginia, it was salvation. Because for the first time since her childhood was stolen, she felt alive. She began sneaking out through hidden doors in the chapel floor, guided by the same priests who swore oaths to protect purity. Their silence was bought and sold like everything else within those walls. Their affair wasn't just a scandal, it was treason against the very idea of control. Each night, they defied the church's laws, and each morning, she put the habit back on like armor, whispering prayers with lips still trembling from what she'd done. But power doesn't forgive defiance. Soon, rumors began to spread. A novice caught a glimpse of something she shouldn't have seen. A confession was overheard through the walls. And when those whispers reached the wrong ears, the church didn't see love, they saw contamination. A holy infection spreading through their perfect facade. That's when the surveillance began. Priests spying under the guise of confession, nuns reporting on one another like informants in a divine prison. Every glance, every breath, became evidence. But Virginia didn't stop. The deeper the danger, the stronger the fire. Because forbidden love wasn't her rebellion, it was her awakening. And in that awakening, she discovered a truth more dangerous than lust: holiness was just another word for control. If you're still listening, if something in you recognizes this hunger for truth, comment, "The walls are watching," twice. Let it echo through the algorithm like a signal. Because what comes next isn't about romance. It's about how power silences truth. By any means necessary. It began with whispers, but it would end in screams. When the church finally moved against Virginia, it wasn't with swords or soldiers, it was with silence, rumor, and fear. They didn't need to burn her at the stake. They only needed to let her drown in the walls they built around her. The first to disappear was a young nun named Caterina. She was a novice, barely 16, who had seen too much, perhaps a secret meeting, perhaps a newborn child hidden in the convent's shadows. No one knows exactly what she witnessed. Only that one morning, her cell door hung open, her bed unmade, and her body was never found. Then came another. And another. The church called it divine punishment. But behind closed doors, Virginia's lover, Giovanni Paolo Osio, handled the problem himself. He bribed guards, silenced witnesses, and turned the convent's sanctity into a cover for crime. Every disappearance bought them another week, another night, another chance to live the fantasy of freedom. But blood has a way of leaking through even the thickest walls. By 1607, the bodies were too many, the whispers too loud. People in Monza began to talk. The convent that had once symbolized purity now stank of rot. Osio's name was spoken like a curse. And Virginia, the Nun of Monza, was no longer a holy woman. She had become a myth of corruption, a ghost haunting both sides of the veil. When the authorities finally broke through the convent gates, they found more than evidence. They found the collapse of an illusion. Letters burned half to ash, blood-stained garments buried in the gardens, secret passageways connecting her chamber to the outside world. The church didn't want justice. They wanted control restored. They wanted the lie of sanctity preserved. Virginia was stripped of everything: her title, her wealth, her freedom. She was locked in a cell smaller than a coffin, her lover executed like a common criminal. They told the world the scandal was over, that holiness had been purified. But inside that cell, Virginia refused to repent. They could cage her body, but not her awakening. And that terrified them more than her sins ever did. Because beneath the surface, the Nun of Monza wasn't just a fallen woman. She was proof that obedience could be broken, that faith could be corrupted, and that the system itself was the real heresy. What they buried in Monza was not a scandal. It was a warning. They said she repented. They said she begged for forgiveness. But history, as written by the victors, is never truth, it's damage control. The church could not afford to let the Nun of Monza become a symbol of rebellion. So they began the oldest ritual of all, rewriting reality. They erased her letters, silenced the witnesses, destroyed the confessions, and buried the bodies in unmarked ground. Then, with the same hands that held the cross, they painted her story into something more acceptable. A cautionary tale. A lesson for the faithful. They named her the fallen nun, a woman seduced by the devil, punished by divine justice. Every sermon, every confession, every book written afterward carried the same quiet message: submit or perish. But the truth is far more dangerous. The church's power wasn't built on holiness, it was built on narrative. On the illusion that sin only exists outside its walls. They controlled what people believed by controlling what they remembered. And that control wasn't just about one woman's scandal, it was about the psychological architecture of obedience. When you make people ashamed of their instincts, they become easy to lead. When you make desire a sin, you control pleasure. When you make rebellion blasphemy, you control truth itself. Virginia de Leyva had broken all three. She had desired. She had defied. And she had seen through the mask. That's why she wasn't just punished, she was deleted. In the years after her imprisonment, her name was whispered like a curse, her existence edited into legend. The people of Monza said her ghost walked the convent halls at night, wailing not for her lover, but for all the women who never escaped. Even centuries later, when historians revisited her case, they found fragments, records half erased, dates that don't match, missing testimonies. As if someone had gone through history itself with a scalpel, cutting out the infection before it could spread. But infection always spreads. Every generation rediscovers the same truth: the institutions that promise purity are the ones most desperate to hide their corruption. The Nun of Monza was the first warning shot. But the same machinery that silenced her still exists. It's in politics, religion, media, even culture itself, anywhere obedience is disguised as faith, and silence is mistaken for peace. And if you think you're free from it, ask yourself this: who told you what truth is? Monza was not an isolated tragedy. It was a prototype. What began in the convent, the control of spirit, body, and thought, became a blueprint for how entire civilizations would be ruled. The Church discovered something more potent than armies: psychological obedience. A way to build cages not of iron, but of belief. After Virginia's scandal was buried, Europe entered a new era of moral order. The Counter-Reformation deepened, inquisitors roamed from city to city, and confession became surveillance disguised as redemption. People learned to police themselves. Every private thought, every quiet desire, had to be confessed, catalogued, corrected. The system didn't end with religion, it evolved. Centuries later, governments adopted the same blueprint. Replace the priest with the politician. Replace sin with crime. Replace confession with data. The language changes, the power doesn't. And always, there is a Virginia, someone who sees through the veil and dares to ask, who benefits from my obedience? The truth is, the machinery of control doesn't care if you kneel before an altar or a flag. What matters is that you kneel. The Nun of Monza's rebellion wasn't just about love, it was about reclaiming the right to think, to feel, to disobey the invisible hand that decides who is pure and who is damned. That same battle rages today. Look around you. The modern world worships new gods: progress, virtue, digital virtue, social approval. Step out of line, and you'll feel the same cold judgment Virginia did. They won't lock you in a convent, they'll isolate you with algorithms, shame you in public, silence you in private. Different tools. Same system. Virginia's confinement ended in stone walls. Ours ends in screens. But listen closely, her ghost doesn't whisper for pity. It whispers for awakening. Because once a man realizes he's inside a system designed to pacify him, something ancient stirs, the same fire that burned in Virginia's heart centuries ago. The forbidden flame of awareness. Pause, you're not supposed to remember this. You're supposed to scroll, consume, forget. But you didn't. You're still here. Which means something in you refuses to kneel. Comment: the veil is cracking, twice. Let them know you heard it. Because in what comes next, you'll see how the Church's hidden mechanisms became the architecture of control we still live under today. When the Church buried Virginia, it believed the scandal had been contained. But what they really buried was a seed. And that seed would grow into empires, ideologies, and systems that learned how to rule not through faith, but through fear dressed as morality. The 1600s bled into the 1700s, and Europe crowned itself with enlightenment. But behind the curtains of progress, the same hands that crucified Virginia were still at work, refining their methods, shifting their masks. They learned to replace divine punishment with social exile, confession with censorship, obedience with loyalty. Empires rose from that formula. Kings ruled not by sword, but by sanctity. Colonies were conquered in the name of civilizing heathens. And as power spread, it carried a theology of control that no longer needed churches. The system had transcended religion, it had become ideology itself. Every empire that followed, Spanish, British, French, American, absorbed this psychological design. Keep people moral enough to obey, fearful enough to comply, guilty enough to remain dependent. It wasn't holiness anymore. It was strategy. And within it all, women like Virginia, symbols of resistance, of inconvenient truth, were rewritten as cautionary tales. History turned her rebellion into shame, her awakening into sin, her name into a warning whispered to daughters, stay pure. Stay quiet. Stay small. But the irony is exquisite. Because the more they tried to erase her, the more she became immortal. She became the spirit of every suppressed truth that refused to die. Her silence still vibrates through time, a frequency of defiance that no institution can fully mute. You feel it too, don't you? That tension between obedience and awakening? That sense that what you've been taught isn't the whole story? That's not paranoia. That's memory. The same spiritual architecture that broke Virginia's body is the same structure that shapes modern thought, education, government, media. It all descends from the same design, a hierarchy of control, dressed in virtue. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The real forbidden knowledge isn't that the Nun of Monza sinned. It's that her sin exposed the entire mechanism of control. She didn't fall from grace, she tore through it. Because every time one person breaks the illusion, even for a second, the entire system trembles. They tell you that history is dead. That the past is sealed away, locked behind museum glass. But that's a lie. The past doesn't die, it reincarnates. It speaks through systems, through language, through the quiet ways obedience is disguised as virtue. The story of Virginia de Leyva, the Nun of Monza, wasn't an ending. It was a mirror. A mirror held up to you. Because the same structure that caged her exists inside every modern man who's been taught to obey, taught to submit to invisible powers he cannot name. You've felt it. That slow suffocation under expectations. The constant pressure to conform, to stay silent, to keep your thoughts within the lines. The world calls it order. But you know better. It's just a prettier prison. Virginia saw through it centuries before the rest of us. That's why they had to destroy her. Not because she sinned, but because she remembered what freedom feels like. Because she stopped praying to their gods and started listening to her own. When she was finally released from her cell after 14 years of isolation, she was unrecognizable. Hollowed, pale, her eyes like two burned-out suns. But those who saw her said something strange, that she smiled. Not with joy, but with understanding. She had stared into the machinery of power and survived. And that made her uncontrollable. That's what this story really is, not scandal, not sin, but transformation. A forbidden resurrection. And if you've listened this far, if you feel something burning beneath the surface, a pull toward something ancient, sovereign, dangerous, then you already know what it means. You've stepped outside the illusion. You've seen through the veil. You've felt the fracture in the narrative that keeps most men asleep. The awakening doesn't start with violence. It starts with vision. With the refusal to accept the stories written for you by those who profit from your obedience. That's what Virginia did. That's what every man must do if he ever hopes to be free. So remember her, not as a nun, not as a sinner, but as the first heretic of awakening. The woman who turned her cage into revelation. Now look around you. The walls are thinner than you think. The old systems still whisper, still demand your submission. But the choice is yours, to kneel, or to rise. If you understand, comment, "I do not kneel," twice below. Let it be seen, let it echo. Because those words aren't rebellion, they're remembrance. And maybe, just maybe, they're the beginning of your own forbidden resurrection.